So you mentioned that you're being charged with a felony. What what did you actually do? How did you get to the place,
Oh, well,
and then what did they charge you with? But if you back up to like,
I can back up to the very beginning
okay,
when, during the height of the civil rights movement in the winter of, what was the year, 65?
I think it was winter of '63, and then you went on January 3rd, '64.
Okay.
Is when,
In any
yeah,
case, uh, I got a phone call from one of the student leaders of the civil rights movement explaining that they were having a problem negotiating with some of the coffee shops where they were attempting to get mixed groups served because the proprietors often considered the students' actions a form of panty raid, just,
right.
college hijinks. They didn't really give a damn about integration, these kids didn't. They're just making noise.
So if you can bring faculty in, it
But if
changes
we
it.
could bring in faculty who would not just go and sit in, as the students were doing, but would go in and reason with the proprietors, uh, assuring them that they would not necessarily lose custom by integrating and not threatening to stay and occupy if turned down, that maybe some progress could be made. So they did recruit a group of 5 of us, and we traveled to Chapel Hill.
So wait, was this? This is during winter break,
Correct.
right? So when did they contact you? A couple weeks before?
Yes.
Okay. So was it like the end of the semester?
Yeah, toward the end of the semester.
And then the new year happens.
Well, first we had a meeting
Okay.
at a local church where there was to have been a doctrination into nonviolent protests,
Sure.
and we had not committed ourselves to staging a sit-in, but we were going to leave ourselves open to that option, and thus agreed to undergo the training that was considered de rigueur for people who were going into civil rights demonstrations.
Who did the training? Do you remember?
Well, no, because I didn't take part in it. It was done by one of the student leaders.
Okay.
However, you have to realize that I'm an old hand at this game. I was served as the youth president of the Fellowship of Reconciliation under Bayard Rustin.
Oh wow!
In my college days, so I had a lot of experience with sit-ins. I mean, I grew up in the Society of Friends and was thus pretty much on the front line from a very early age.
And were you part of CORE as
Yes.
well? Is that okay?
Yes, founding member.
And the students aren't going to know what CORE is.
Nope.
So, can you give a synopsis of that was while you were at UCLA?
Yep.
Can you what is CORE?
Committee on Racial Equality. It was the first activist group, well, one of the first activist groups to engage in demonstrations opposing segregation.
And are there leaders of CORE students may have heard of?
Oh, I doubt it.
Okay.
In any event, I mean that's.
So there was a training you didn't need to attend because you knew.
Well, I had planned to attend, but though I realized it was superfluous. But as I approached the church, I met one of my college co-conspirators, another member. In fact, he was the youth president just ahead of me, David McReynolds, who went on to become a professional agitator, member of the staff on the War Resisters League, In fact, he also was a presidential candidate for the Socialist Worker Party. But we were college students together. We were both members of FOR. David, as I indicated, had preceded me as the youth president. And here he was on the payroll of the Village Voice in New York.
Yeah.
And had come down from New York to cover the whole series of demonstrations that were going on in Chapel Hill at the time.
So he wasn't living here. He was coming down as a reporter.
He came down as a reporter.
And you had no idea you would see him.
He had no idea that I was going to be involved in anything.
Right.
He knew I was here at Duke, but we hadn't been in close contact, but we had been very close friends up to that time. So when we saw each other, we said, the heck with our other obligations, let's go have coffee and a long talk. So I made my excuses to the others, said, I don't need this training, goodbye. And David and I went off to a local coffee house and spent the afternoon chatting. That's not a trivial point to remember. In any event, then when the day came for the occasion where we were to confront the proprietor of this place called Watson's Grill. Watts Grill. We pulled up into the parking lot in the evening on a very cold, rainy day. And
what time ballpark was it with you that you pulled
late
up?
afternoon.
Okay.
But
it gets dark early. Yeah.
It was January, and we were jumped in the parking lot. It became quite obvious that the Watts and his staff had gotten advance word of our coming, probably from one of the sheriff's deputies, because at that time every single sheriff's car in Hillsborough had a Klan sticker. In any event, they jumped us and beat us bloody. The police were there, and they just stood. And these were Chapel Hill police and a couple of Hillsborough sheriff's deputies, and they stood and just watched the beating and the hosing.
Hosing means squirting you with water.
Put the hose right under our shirts.
And on a very cold...
It was just barely above freezing. And the police just watched. And then when the blood began seriously flowing, and one of the people indeed, a professor of psychology from Carolina, had to be carted off to hospital with scalp injuries. At that point, they finally stopped the beating, arrested us, and took us off to the Hillsborough jail.
So my son, I was telling my son a little bit about this, and he couldn't understand why they would arrest you and not the people who did the beating. And I explained to him a little bit of the dynamic you just talked about with the stickers. But could you again just unpack it for students? Like what was it like in the 60s?
So we never got inside. Well, one of the let me back up again. We were 5 faculty and 2 students. The faculty were all white because the black faculty from North Carolina Central were at the last minute told they would be fired if they participated in this demonstration.
Wow.
So 2 black students took their place, but the rest of us were faculty.
So it was meant to be all faculty. It wasn't, okay, got it.
And the 2 black kids were dragged into the entrance of the restaurant and beaten bloody there. The rest of us were just beaten on the sidewalk or on the parking lot. We were then all arrested and had multiple charges. It was trespass, assault on a female, a couple of other charges. pretty serious charges. As our attorney said afterwards, you guys got a tiger by the tail.
None of which you had done. You just were getting out of your car, getting ready to possibly talk to the people,
Exactly.
and they attacked you.
The others were all from the divinity school. Well, no, all but one. One member of the faculty was a mathematician. I was a biologist. The other three were other two from Duke were from the divinity school, and then one psychologist from Carolina.
If you had tried to say to this is a ridiculous question, but if you had tried to say to the police, well, we want to press charges because they attacked us, what would have happened?
That's what we told our lawyer, and he said, one step at a time. It then turned out all of the lawyers who were advising us were from the Duke Law School, and none of them had licenses to practice law. So none of them could defend us. And they, after calling around over a 2-day period, came to us and said, we cannot find a single lawyer in the state of North Carolina who's willing to defend you. And that's when they said one step at a time, when we said we want to press charges.
Wow.
So they continued searching, and finally, Bill Van Alstyne, who was the constitutional specialist at the law school, professor of constitutional law, came up with a candidate for a defending lawyer. He said, this guy is really bright, but unfortunately, he's not going to do you much good. He's the sort who will quote Aristotle to the jury, and I don't think that's what you need. But he said, this is the only guy who will do the job. So we better take him, and we'll see how far we get.
And you went all the way.
So then the others, I think I was the third or fourth one tried. The others were convicted within minutes. And when my jury came, it hung. First 7-5, and then gradually the numbers in support of me dwindled. But one jurywoman held out.
You found that out afterwards, I presume. Yeah.
Long afterwards. And it turned out that surmise I had made as to why I had a hung jury and the others hadn't turned out to be correct. Because when I was called to trial, I was asked to put my hand on the Bible and swear, and I said, I cannot do that. And the judge ordered the jury out of the room and then cited me for contempt and sentenced me to 30 days in jail. So I was let off to the pokey, and immediately my lawyer called, I've forgotten his name, a famous professor of law at Carolina, who was head of the state ACLU and quite a famous civil libertarian. And he came rushing into court and read to the judge a statute passed in 1890 by the legislature of North Carolina, which says that any member of the Society of Friends who states that he or she is a member shall be excused from the laying of hands on the Bible or stating or making an oath. And I didn't know about that bit of legislation, and evidently the judge didn't either. So he.
Did you have to spend any days in court, in jail on the contempt?
I spent a day in jail. a day and a night, I think it was. Anyway, I got released, and the jury got wind of that. I suspected that it happened because I knew that North Carolina, and this part of North Carolina, had in the early days, now I'm talking 17th century and early 18th century, was heavily populated by Quakers. George Fox had made a visit to North Carolina in the 17th century and had encouraged members of the society to immigrate here. Quakers were largely involved in the regulation movement, which was the preliminary to the Revolutionary War.
Some students might know the bookshop, the regulator.
Correct.
On
They
Ninth.
may not know the history of the movement, but it had its start in Hillsborough. And, you know, the story's largely told in terms of a bunch of drunken farmers who didn't like to pay taxes on the whiskey that they were distilling. But in fact, that was partially true. But much of the regulation movement was led by sober-minded Quakers who felt it improper to be taxed without representation. So there was a very respectable element to the regulation movement, and the Quakers got a lot of credit for that. So there was, even in segregated Hillsborough, which was the center of the Piedmont KKK, even in that part of North Carolina, there was still a certain degree of respect for and sympathy toward Quakers. Not entirely deserved in my judgment, but there it was, a soft spot. And I think that's probably why I got the benefit of the doubt. And in the end, the one jurywoman who held out, it turned out, had as a father-in-law a 80-year-old Episcopal priest who was an active member of the Chapel Hill community that was regularly protesting in front of the post office, protesting against segregation and laws prohibiting integration.
Huh.
And so her relationship to this priest had not been uncovered by the solicitors, so he hadn't gotten rid of her.
And because it was a hung jury, that's where they could have done a retrial, but they instead decided to use this procedural.
No. They put me on for a retrial. But then the court session was fairly short, so the retrial couldn't take place until the next term of court, which was 3 months or so later.
So the initial trial was March, I think.
Correct.
Okay.
And then they had lots of other trials of all the other defendants, and the bulk of the defendants transferred their cases to federal court, but that took a lot of time too. And by the time the docket was clear enough for me to be retried, term of court had ended, and the next term wasn't until September. In the interim, Congress had passed the Public Accommodations Act, and the federal courts, ruled that it applied retroactively. In other words, I could not be tried again because as soon as my name was put on the docket and it was called, I could file a motion to be transferred to federal court and the case would be dismissed.
Wow, okay.
So that's why the judge and the solicitor hit on this technique. They were going to file a null pros with leave. Granted, says the judge. So then I'm on the docket. I have to appear in court and sit in court from sunup to sundown. But until my name is called, I can't file that motion to go to federal court. So guess what? They had me in court all day, every day,
How many days did you have to go?
many.
Like 50?
Yeah, something like that. I've lost track.
Would you have to? So would they have court Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday? And
Something like that. There was one day I remember where I'd been led to believe, I don't remember exactly how it came about, I'd been led to believe that there would not be court that day. So I stayed in my lab, and guess what?
there was.
The sheriff came, handcuffs, marched me through campus in handcuffs, put me in the squad car, drove me into Hillsborough, and put me in the pokey for failure to appear in court. But they didn't call me, so they couldn't keep me there more than the 24 hours before bond can be posted. But it was a warning, I better not miss any days in court. So that's the point at which we first filed an appeal to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And they, strangely enough, ruled that yes, I had a right to a speedy trial, but not if there was going to be a trial. I couldn't insist on a trial.
So the speedy trial attaches once the trial starts.
Correct. And no, I can't insist on having my name called for trial.
So
at
the whole semester you couldn't do. Could you teach? Could you like what?
No. Luckily, I had a very sympathetic chair who covered for me.
Could you do work while you were in the court?
I had a very good staff. I was well supported. You know, I had one of the biggest labs in my department, more students than any other member of my department, full-time secretary, full-time technicians, 3, 4. So I had a lot of help. So my work got done. Not quite in the way I'd like, but it got done. And I didn't have to worry about teaching. My graduate students got what they needed from me after hours, and the undergraduates were handled for me by my colleagues.
So what time did you have to show up at the court in the morning?
9 o'clock.
And you 4 or 5 o'clock? When did they? Somewhere.
It varied in the
okay.
afternoon. It varied. Look, it was often early enough that I could still get work done during the day.
So that went on August, September, October, November, just
I think 3 months, maybe. No,
Okay.
not quite that long. I think maybe 10 weeks with court, something like that. So at that point, when the Supreme Court turned us down, North Carolina Supreme Court, we were pretty desperate, and Wade said, "Let's file a
writ of cert, right?
Writ of certiorari." He said, "The odds are really against us, but I don't know what else to do. You just don't have the money to go up through the appeals process, and even getting the money for the writ of cert was going to be trying." So we filed it, and the ACLU decided it would not prepare it for us on the grounds that the case was not of general significance, and they couldn't afford to use their resources for cases that were unique. This is such an unusual procedure. It probably doesn't affect anyone outside of the state of North Carolina.
Sure.
And most people to whom it is applied are quite happy to have it applied for the reasons that I gave you.
So, but while you're waiting for the Supreme Court to either take or not take your case, were you able to, did you still have to go to court every day?
Well, then we were between sessions.
Okay.
So I didn't have to go. The 10 weeks, of course, it was in session, and it would be 3 months not in session. So it was off and on, sporadic.
But throughout 65, you had to
Yeah,
keep doing it.
yeah. And in the meantime, though, my former colleagues at Yale set up a defense fund and raised a lot of money. So at least we had money to pay the printing costs and the travel costs and so forth. Some modest salary for my poor overworked lawyer who had political ambitions, but clearly had signed a death warrant in that regard, as a result of having defended this commie
Quaker.
commie Quaker. Yeah, well, I was not popular. In any event,
What was the reaction at Duke?
the university at the highest level was supportive. At the level of the faculty, divided, except for my department. My department is solely behind me, but I got nasty comments from a lot of other professors. Student opinion, definitely majority opposed.
Really?
Oh yeah, Duke was very much a Southern school back then.
Yeah.
We'd only just begun ourselves to accept black students.
And that was only the professional
Yeah.
schools, right?
So
We're gonna hit
anyway,
stop for a second.